It's Sunday, April 5, 2026. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a leading scholar of public opinion and its influence on public policy and political outcomes, a highly respected political scientist and founder and director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Larry Jacobs, welcome to the Weekend Show.
It's great to be with you, Anthony.
Larry, I'm not sure where to start because it seems that in every direction that we look right now, the Trump administration is fighting fires. Maybe we should start with what he said this week, that it's not possible for the U.S. to pay for Medicaid, Medicare and daycare. We're fighting wars, he said, and urged states to fund benefit programs instead, he said, because we have to take care of one thing, military protection, he said. You've written extensively on the Affordable Care Act. Did Trump just say the quiet part out loud regarding his view of government support for working Americans?
Yeah, I think the question right now is Donald Trump the president of the United States, or is this a faction that he is giving voice to? This is not the view of the vast majority of Americans who rely on Medicare. They increasingly rely on the Affordable Care Act, which has now been largely accepted by Americans and, frankly, the healthcare system. So I think Donald Trump's idea that we're going to become a war state, it's just not supported in the country. And the Republicans I talk to and listen to agree. They see Donald Trump steering them into a Waterloo, a political Waterloo. It's just a situation where they're likely to certainly lose the House of Representatives, but increasingly the odds even in losing the Senate seem to be rising because he is so disinterested really in the views of Americans.
And with that, he's just requested a vast amount more money to pay for the military. I mean, you speak of him thinking of himself as a wartime president and focusing entirely on war, not least Iran. I mean, he's been talking about Cuba and goodness knows what else. Could this be heading towards a place whereby a combination of looking at the polls and seeing how they could be destroyed in November, that actually to claim war powers, to cancel elections and to do our worst fear, because I think we've all feared this, is the direction it looks like he might be headed?
Well, I have no doubt that Donald Trump at this point believes himself capable of those things, but we are seeing an increasing number of areas, whether it's the tariff decision by the Supreme Court, or the 2025 election results, or the remarkable mobilization across America in the No Kings rally, that he is coming up against the reality. He cannot alone cancel American democracy. He's learning that lesson, and I think the institutions are standing up. There's also, increasingly a point where Republicans in Congress are facing a very difficult choice for them. They can defy the president, perhaps in a finesse sort of way, and run the risk of having him challenge them for their renomination. Or they can go into an election and face the real prospects of losing because the positions that the president is taking are increasingly far out of step with where the country is. This is not a country that supports war making. It's not what he ran on as a MAGA candidate. And so I think, that's the spot is I don't see Donald Trump at this point as being a powerful threat to the democracy. I think he's a powerful threat to himself. I think he's a powerful threat to other Republicans, but he's wounded, and the political landmines and winds are heading his way.
But he does have a habit of ignoring the courts. And I mean, if we use the ballroom as an example, knocking down the East Wing before he gets permission, then kind of retrospectively the court stops him from continuing the project. He creates some kind of fake group that say he does have permission, and then kind of carries on and ignores the court. I mean, could we not apply his logic to warmongering as well?
Yeah, I think the defiance is a real issue, and we've certainly seen it, in the case of the White House remodeling. But he still needs the participation of the courts to follow what he needs, whether it's some kind of agreement on the tariffs or criminal justice prosecutions. And in those areas, the courts are not going along, and there's really nothing that Donald Trump can do to just to override that. I think he's going to certainly need money from Congress. He's asking for over $1 trillion for this war period, and there's no chance that Congress is going to approve that. So we have seen this side of Donald Trump where he talks a big game and then he backs down. According to what used to be known as the Defense Department, he's asking for a fraction of that amount. This could be a bargaining strategy where he's going for something huge and then we'll agree to something much smaller, which is still an enormous amount of money and will require still further cuts in much needed domestic programs. This is not, the president that we saw a year ago, where it looked like he was a king and that he was getting his way. I see this president as increasingly weak and running into barriers and blockades and getting weaker.
And with that, because of his mental health, because of the narcissistic personality disorder, it will cause him to push further. So as he feels like he is losing grip and losing control, and the courts are winning, and the mood, you mentioned no kings, of course, 10 million people taking to the streets. He is shielded from much of that, and he kind of brushes it off. But as a narcissist, it kind of hurts him, doesn't it? My fear, though, is that when he feels those things, the authoritarian in him pushes further forward.
And I think that is a real possibility. I'm not in any way, just imagining or seeing scenarios. They're going to follow some romantic idea of checks and balances. I think the old idea that America had this kind of well-balanced government, that's out the window. That's clearly not the case. We have an authoritarian in the White House who has disinterest in the law and the Constitution, who on many fronts is pursuing his own agenda, even when his own party is against them. What I'm saying, though, is will he succeed in these initiatives? And I'm just less and less impressed by how much he's actually getting done. And I think what we're going to see, with this war-making president is Congress, will most likely pass some kind of bill providing military support. But that bill is going to have all sorts of checks in it. The administration will be required to report every few months. There'll be money held back unless he follows through on certain commitments, such as a time limit or a need to come back to Congress and secure authorization if he were to commit troops. I mean, these are the kinds of things that Congress can do, and Donald Trump, I don't think, can evade them because he doesn't literally control, the flow of money. I think at the end of the day, that's going to be, the stop on him. We go back to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, at the end, narcissist, was a lot smarter than Donald Trump. This was a guy who was really, in a lot of ways, devious and brilliant. And at the end, Richard Nixon found himself handcuffed because he needed the money from Congress. Ultimately, even when he was moving things around, and he also, blocked spending. It was called impoundments. And eventually his own party deserts him. And it wasn't, I would say, a high moral stand. It was Republicans just saw themselves facing political peril. If they didn't stand up to a president, it was increasingly unpopular. By the way, Donald Trump is now more unpopular than he's ever been, including his first term. And When I look at the polls, I'm impressed. There's like 10, 20 or so percent of Republicans who are now consider him to be a poor president on national security, the economy, inflation, other issues. This is the guy, when he won election, he had like 95% support among Republicans. And most damaging to the president and other Republicans, we've seen a very sharp shift among independents who are going to be very important in some of these difficult competitive races for the U.S. Senate. It's not going to be possible for Susan Collins to win if we see independents by 3-1 margin moving against Donald Trump. It's going to be devastating, and she's not the only one.
But that's what Democrats have been saying. Certainly, yeah. Chuck Schumer's been saying. Yeah. It's all about the numbers, and if Trump is polling in the 30s, then they don't stand a chance of winning in the midterms. But this poses a question about the elephant in the room, and that is that why have Republicans not stepped up and done their duty to, as in Nixon's case, call for him to resign? It isn't happening. There isn't even a murmur of it. They're obviously terrified, not just of the leverage that he has, but also the fear of retribution in some other way. I mean, some of them are actually scared for their physical health as well. So do you think that, just from your perspective, do you think that there will come a breaking point? Because he's breaking much of the world right now.
Yeah. Well, I think we are probably approaching one of the breaking points. But I think it's very important to understand the calculations of Republicans in Congress today. Today, Republicans and Democrats cannot win nomination to run for office again unless they secure an election victory in the primaries. And those primaries are dominated, for the most part, by folks who tend to be more liberal and progressive than the rest of the country, and far more conservative and right-wing than the rest of the country in the Republican side. And that's what Donald Trump has been able to rely on, this kind of MAGA base that, threw Liz Cheney out because she crossed them, and other Republicans. But we now have a situation that's changing. Donald Trump going to war has alienated the MAGA base. Donald Trump ran on the end of these forever wars, and that's exactly what he's brought us into. And so Republicans in Congress are sizing that up. There'll be plenty, particularly in the House, who will just see Donald Trump as the path to their renomination, and they will stick with him no matter what. But there are Republicans who are more moderate districts in the House, and certainly in the Senate, which is a more complex set of elections. You look at North Carolina, Maine, Ohio, perhaps Iowa, Alaska, and others that are going to be critical in the coming 2026 Senate races. And it's a balance. They're really trying to figure out, are they facing more of a threat from crossing Donald Trump or from crossing the Republican primary voter? And so, yes, I do think, there are going to be moments when Republicans are standing up to Trump, and we're already seeing it. I mean, Donald Trump wanted the filibuster to be eliminated. It's been weakened, but now he said, let's eliminate it so he could pass what is known as the Save America Act, which is an effort to really roll back voting rights and access to the ballot. And the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, John Thune, has said, no, we're not going to do that. And he had his own calculation there. It wasn't like he discovered political courage, but he's sizing up his own situation and counting votes in the Senate among his Republican colleagues. So, yes, I think there's no doubt Donald Trump is a threat. He is an authoritarian. He is doing great damage in this country and, as you said, globally. But I don't think this is someone who is seeing their power grow. I think he's facing increasing limits and vulnerabilities that are going to be playing out in the coming weeks and months.
The war in Iran, I think Trump thought he could do a kind of Venezuela Maduro situation, go in, regime change, and get out again and take all the glory. Iran is not going to let this war end anytime soon, even if Trump was to pretend that America had won and withdraw all troops. Iran won't stop their campaign, certainly in the short term, and they are holding the world to ransom with this energy crisis. Do you think that Trump realizes quite what he's bitten off? Because, I mean, as far as we know, he is not getting good advice. And any advice he gets, I mean, they just fired the chief of the army. I mean, this is, an example of how little respect they have for people who bring experience to the table, especially when you're talking about the theater of war.
Well, any president runs the risk of being isolated. And whether it was Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton talked about being a prisoner in the most gold surrounded prison cell ever. Barack Obama, used to just bolt out of the White House to go mingle with people. These were not terribly meaningful, but it tells you that any president, because they're in a cocoon surrounded with people who are loyal to them and who are desperate to please the president, they're always vulnerable to this. And you have to work very hard to get candid advice and information. And there are ways in which smart presidents have done that. Donald Trump is not one of them. And so, yes, I think he's certainly being isolated. He's being fed information that is not accurate. There's stories about his staff providing him with videos of American bombs and missiles blowing things up. And this is the reality he sees. But the situation on the ground doesn't conform to that. And again, this is not a situation he's going to be able to walk away from. That speech he gave, earlier this week, it really wasn't connected to reality. I mean, this idea that he can pull out in a few weeks and leave the Strait of Hormuz under Iranian control, that's a myth, because it will lead to great political and economic costs in the United States of America because of the high and rising fuel costs. So he'll have to stay for that. And I think, the effects of the continuing Iranian drone and missile strikes continue even today. And, ever since he gave that speech, it's not devastating, but it's enough where, our allies are finding their gas and oil facilities being disrupted or blown up. And Israel continues to be, bombed. And its citizens are having to spend more and more time in bomb shelters. Schools are canceled. This is just not a situation that's going to conform to the Venezuelan situation, which was a kind of an overnight, snatch and grab. This is going to be long. It's going to be brutal. It could be a quagmire for America. And Donald Trump's, storytelling is not going to be able to make that go away.
The fear is of the war widening through the region to the Gulf nations, if it hasn't already. And we know that missiles and certainly drones have already landed in places where even Donald Trump has properties. I mean, this is a huge problem for these Gulf nations that have been trying to rewrite their own history, welcome international business people and tourists, and change the face of that region. How much damage do you think that this war, and certainly Donald Trump's part in it, is gonna do to the future of those nations that are still trying to present a very kind of positive image of the Middle East?
It's confusing and it seems contradictory. It probably is. You've got a president who believes himself to be authoritarian, who's able to do what he wants. He's now launched the war on his own and used America's fearsome military might to do great damage and destruction. But that's different from being able to actually develop a strategy and to have a strategy. And I think what a lot of us see is someone who's kind of preoccupied with the weapons of destruction, but doesn't really have a purpose for their use. And so, yes, I think the Gulf nations are quite concerned. They don't want to be in a situation of great vulnerability, but they also don't see a way in which the United States can simply walk away. They don't want the Iranians posing such a dire threat, and that dire threat remains, despite what Donald Trump says. The U.S. intelligence services and others are reporting that the Iranians have plenty of missiles and drones left. The idea that they're wiped out, it's just not the reality, and we continue to see that. So, I think this is a terrible situation for the kind of modernizing that's been going on in the Middle East. There's a really remarkable change that's happened, and it presents some really remarkable opportunities for the future. But this moment right now that Donald Trump has created is a tremendous threat, and it needs to be brought under some level of control. Right now, it's just anarchy and tremendous violence and destruction.
Arguably, it's worse now than it was the day before the war started in terms of Iran's threat to its neighbors and to the rest of the world. Would you say that he's actually made things much worse?
Well, Donald Trump looks at it and he counts the number of missiles we've blown up. He looks at the killing of the Iranian leadership, and he counts that to be victories. But if you go back to what he was saying before the war, about wiping out their nuclear weapons, regime change, and other sorts of things, that's not going to happen. And I think the Iranians now appreciate a fundamental and unavoidable reality. Every day that they can drag out this war, shoot down American aircraft, bomb, one of the Middle Eastern countries' oil or gas facilities, and control the Strait of Hormuz, raises the political costs of Donald Trump. And that is just, unavoidable. And no matter what Donald Trump says in a national speech, it is the drip, drip, drip. And he's giving these time markers, 2 weeks, 3 weeks will be out. It's just not true. And so in a month's or 2 months' time, we may still be locked in, and the costs will be high and growing. And at that point, I do think we're going to see more and more Republicans breaking from the president. We've been here before, and I don't think Donald Trump is immune to the backlash within his own party as a reflection of the backlash in the country and even among Republicans. And I've been following this closely. There is a vast majority of Republicans that support Donald Trump, continue to, but there's also this group of Republicans, depending on the poll you look at, it's about 11, 12% up to maybe 30%, who are now, expressing the fact that they disapprove of Donald Trump's leadership in Iran and on other issues. That's significant because it's going to be something that other Republicans in Congress are tracking, particularly when they're in these more competitive states.
More than 100 international law experts have signed an open letter warning that American military strikes on Iran violate international law. They could amount to war crimes, as Trump threatened to destroy Iran's civilian infrastructure unless the country's leaders agree to his demands. And you mentioned that kind of insane speech that he gave a few days ago, which made no sense and arguably made everything worse. Do you think he is aware that these types of threats, and indeed certainly with the shooting of the girls' school that happened in the first 24 hours of the war, I mean, do you think that he is even aware that he's committing war crimes, and or is he beyond that point now? It's all about him, and who cares what the consequences are?
Yeah, I don't think Donald Trump knows that. I don't think he cares. I think, for me, the very significant point here is that the growing distance between American conduct of foreign policy and national security and international law. Donald Trump is an egregious example, but this has been a trend over the last 3, 4, 5 decades. There was a period around the Vietnam War where Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency, and he was calling attention to the fact that presidents were exercising power that was not assigned to them in the Constitution. For instance, committing over 500,000 troops to Vietnam without a declaration of war. And, since that period, there have been literally hundreds of instances in which presidents have, committed, violent acts. And this is across Republican and Democratic administrations. Barack Obama significantly expanded the use of drone strikes in northern Pakistan because he was trying to pursue the Taliban. And there were, international legal experts calling that out. Barack Obama used drones to conduct assassinations of individuals he considered to be a threat to the United States because they were part of Al Qaeda and trying to recruit terrorists in the United States. And you had Democrats and some Republicans coming out and saying that this was, against American law and certainly in the international arena. So I think it's very important to appreciate that Donald Trump is an extension of a trend that we've seen in America for some time. He is an extraordinary extension, no doubt, but we've had a pattern of lawlessness in American foreign policy and national security policy for some time, to the point that both Democratic and Republican presidents, administrations accept that as part of, what they need to do to keep America safe.
What's changed, though, is that whereas our international allies might have turned a blind eye previously because relations with the US were strong, not least for trade and national security. But this time, Trump is almost seeking to break up these relationships. And I mean, the UK Prime Minister is now persona non grata, it seems. And Emmanuel Macron, a couple of days ago, said, Trump needs to be serious. Of course, you can't expect, anyone to police the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, we're starting to hear and Spain, I should probably mention as well, the Spanish Prime Minister is just having none of it. So we're starting to see the breakdown of these alliances. And I guess that's what's different this time around with Trump in charge, is that the world order is shifting. And it held over Vietnam, it held over Iraq and Afghanistan. But this time is different.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, I would add to that list that you've provided, the Prime Minister of Canada, who speech to an international gathering, talked about Trump as, doing great damage to and really ending NATO and the international order, rules-based order that the United States had helped to build after World War II. So yes, I think we're in a very different context. It's still not clear exactly at this point what the consequences of that are going to be for the United States and Donald Trump. I don't see a case where Donald Trump's going to be arrested and charged and prosecuted. That's not going to happen. Would there be organizing to inflict punishment, economic punishment in the United States? I don't see that happening. But I do think it's, the end of the coalition that had existed for, more than half a century. And now the United States will be in a weaker position internationally. Our great strength before Donald Trump was our allies. We could go into the Pacific and face China knowing that we had some very deep-rooted shared values, that there were ongoing military relationships based on trust and on mutual support. And Donald Trump has, pulled the rug out on that. So, as you move forward, the question is going to be, is America more able to check China if it were to go into Taiwan? Is it going to be more able to check a Putin-led Russia as it continues to threaten Ukraine and, God forbid, topple Ukraine and then threaten Poland? Is the United States and Western Europe better able to check that? And I think the answer to all that is clearly no. That we've kind of lost the teamwork that we once had because Donald Trump has an idea that the costs of working with others is higher than the benefits, and that's a view that no other American political leaders had. I think it's wrong and it's an aberration.
But those two conflicts that you mention, Ukraine and Taiwan, Trump is on the wrong side of those. He actually wants China to take Taiwan. He wants Russia to take Ukraine. And the media and certainly the international community are taking too long, in my opinion, to say that out loud. I mean, is their theory that if you don't mention it, it might go away? Because as I see it, this is only going to get worse.
Well, I agree with you. It's only going to get worse. I think Trump's coalition to allow Taiwan to fall into Chinese orbit of influence, and that can happen in a lot of ways. It doesn't mean that the Chinese literally have boots in the ground, but that is a position that would have ferocious opposition within the Republican Party, even a Republican Party that is as compliant as this one. And I think the threat of Putin on Poland would again provoke pretty widespread and actionable opposition in Congress. I mean, it's one thing to have a Middle Eastern war. It's another thing for this to be in Western Europe, the Pacific, where you've got major U.S. Allies that we rely on economically. I think the blowback on what's happening in the Middle East and Donald Trump's incompetence and dangerous conduct that's doing great harm to our allies all through the Middle East. This is not good news for Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Qatar and the other countries that we have been building stronger and stronger relationships with. This is going to make it more difficult for Donald Trump to proceed. That's why I say I think the main theme here for me is that this is a very different president than we had a year ago. A year ago, he was riding high. There was great fear that this was a guy who was going to become a dictator. And I think in his mind, he continues to view himself as someone with unlimited powers. But I don't think that's the reality. And I think whether it was the elections in 2025, whether it's, it doesn't always get media coverage, but Republicans in Congress have been standing up to him. The filibuster, the budget that was passed 6 months ago, and other matters. And then, the looming 2026 elections, which despite whatever Donald Trump tries, will almost certainly go against Republicans in the House. And we'll see what happens in the Senate. I think what was unthinkable a year ago is now seeming at least possible that Republicans could lose the majority they have in the U.S. Senate. So all this is, part of the future we're heading into.
We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about domestic issues, not least the firing of the Attorney General Pam Bondi. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. I realized my morning routine was basically just survival mode. Alarm, coffee, panic, repeat. And honestly, I never questioned the coffee, even though it was wrecking me. Jitters, crash, brain fog by like 2 p.m. So I started looking into alternatives, and that's how I found Mudwater. I've actually been using their blends for a while now, and what I love is the energy feels steady. Not that wired spike, just focused. Their original mix has cacao, chai, turmeric, and functional mushrooms like lion's mane and reishi. So you're getting that mental clarity without the chaos. And if you're like me and not ready to fully give up coffee, their new low-caf blend is Kind of perfect. It tastes like real coffee, but it's only got 45 milligrams of caffeine, so no jitters, no crash, just a smoother start to the day. I've been making it in the mornings, sometimes adding a little creamer, super easy, and honestly, it just feels like a better ritual. If you're trying to upgrade your mornings without going full robot mode, this is worth checking out. Ready to make the switch to cleaner energy? Head to mudwater.com and grab your starter kit today. Right now, our listeners get up to 43% off starter kits, plus free shipping and a free rechargeable frother when you use code WEEKEND. That's up to 43% off with code WEEKEND at mudwtr.com. After you purchase, they'll ask how you found them. Let them know that we sent you. Thanks to HomeServe for sponsoring this episode. Owning a home is amazing, until it's not. 1 minute you're relaxing with your morning coffee, the next you're ankle deep in water because a pipe decided today was the day. It's always the worst timing, right? Repairs don't wait, and they definitely don't care about your budget. I had one of those moments. My water heater started acting up out of nowhere. Suddenly I was scrambling, Googling contractors, wondering how much it was about to cost me, and spoiler, emergency home repairs are never cheap. HomeServe, though, was great, and I was thrilled with the service they provided. Here's the thing, most homeowners' insurance doesn't cover a lot of these everyday breakdowns. Plumbing issues, HVAC problems, electrical hiccups, you're usually on your own. That's where HomeServe comes in. They offer plans that are basically like a subscription for your home, from as little as $4.99 a month, and you can choose the coverage that fits your needs and budget. So instead of panicking and searching for help when something breaks, you just call their 24/7 hotline and get the repair process started. It's simple. Pick a plan, enroll, and if something covered goes wrong, you've got a path forward. They've been helping homeowners for over 20 years and work with a network of local, reliable, licensed professionals across the country. With over 4.5 million customers and a 4.8 out of 5 post-repair rating and an A+ BBB rating, a lot of people are already trusting them for that extra peace of mind. So, protect your home systems and your wallet from covered repairs. Plans start at just $4.99 a month. Go to HomeServe.com to find the plan that's right for you. That's HomeServe.com. Not available everywhere. Most plans range between $4.99 and $11.99 a month for your first year. Terms apply on covered repairs. We're back on the weekend show with Dr. Larry Jacobs. I'm Anthony Davis. Larry, the big news of the week was Pam Bondi being unceremoniously removed. Donald Trump has a habit of not firing people and sending them into exile, but kind of keeping them in his orbit. He certainly did this with Kristi Noem, and we're seeing it now with Pam Bondi. I mean, there was talk of her going into the private sector, but of course that could mean anything, could mean going to work for one of Trump's firms. So we're looking at somebody whose timing in this was very interesting. Bondi was due to give testimony over the Epstein files. Apparently that will still happen, but she's not the Attorney General. How does that change things? And do you think that the timing of this firing will benefit Donald Trump in the long run, or could it actually be detrimental?
You and I are consumed with what's happened with Pam Bondi, as are, others who are just consumed with politics. I just think this is so under the radar for most Americans, even Americans who are interested in politics. The reality is that Pam Bondi will be replaced by another Trump loyalist, that Donald Trump continues to view the Department of Justice as a weapon for retribution on his part and trying to even scores. Even though the criminal justice system, including judges that Donald Trump has appointed, are consistently blocking some of these efforts. And I think Pam Bondi's reason for departing is, in doing Donald Trump's work, she became a liability to him. And in not doing it well enough, she really found herself on Donald Trump's must fire list. So I think that's very important to understand, that Donald Trump is getting rid of Pam Bondi because she wasn't more effective in pursuing his retribution strategy. So, yeah, we could talk about Pam Bondi and her kind of sad future. But I think the more important thing for the country is, will there be a change in the Justice Department from being what had been an independent source of impartial conduct of the criminal justice system? And I see no chance of that. I think it's going to continue to be an extension of Donald Trump's resentments, rage, and political vendettas.
Todd Blanche was the deputy. He is currently running it interim. It's likely he may kind of stay on. Ultimately, he was Donald Trump's personal lawyer in all of these criminal cases. I don't disagree with you at all. It is interesting, though, that optics are kind of really more important for Donald Trump than anything else. So from a public perspective, what do you think he thinks the public will glean from his firing of Pam Bondi and then replacing her with somebody who arguably is worse?
Donald Trump is, I think, scrambling about looking for a way to kind of change the story. The speech earlier this week kind of vaguely talking about the end of the war approaching, even though it's probably not going to happen. The great victories we're having in Iran, which, are happening at a tactical level, even though the U.S. is probably in a more vulnerable position. I mean, that was one effort to kind of let's change the storyline here. Getting rid of Pam Bondi, he saw that as well. This will change the story about the Epstein files, which have gotten very, very close to Donald Trump. They're burning under his very feet because of his close relationships with Epstein and others in Donald Trump's orbit, including some of the cabinet members. But I think that also will fall flat. The Congress, because of the Republican base, and particularly the MAGA base, are absolutely locked in on the Epstein files as the prime example of how the wealthy and powerful get away, even with pedophilia. And we now know that Epstein was involved in all sorts of financial dealings as well.
And political, so it turns out.
And political, yeah. So this story is not going to go away because the Republican base is locked in on it. Democrats try to take advantage of it, but it's really being propelled by Republican voters and loyalists who were told that they were going to get to the bottom of this. And then Donald Trump, once he was in office, tried to bury the story. And Pam Bondi did just a colossally mistake in how she tried to handle it, to the point that they ended up releasing millions and millions of pages, some of which are quite damning of the president and his allies. So, they bring in someone new, but I think, it's a change in characters, but not a change in the basic storyline here of the Justice Department as an extension of Donald Trump's effort to have power and to pursue vendettas. I don't think it's going to have any real impact on the fact that Donald Trump is in real political peril now. I think he's increasingly in. It's not that he's unpopular; it's just that the lack of confidence and trust in him has plummeted, and that is a currency. And so I think, giving a national speech on prime time, firing a prominent member of your administration, it's not going to make that much of a difference. In 2 weeks, we're not going to be talking about it.
Right. And it's the same with Mark Wayne Mullin replacing Kristi Noem. I mean, these are just identikit leaders, effectively, that where loyalty is more important than experience.
I have to say, in the new leadership at the Department of Homeland Security, being a resident of Minnesota, so far there has been a difference. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of ICE agents and other agents, storming around the streets in the Twin Cities, and a lot of those folks are gone. I'm not saying they're all gone, but a lot of them are gone, and certainly the most egregious public snatching of people who, we're simply exercising their rights to observe, sometimes to protest, or just simply going about their business. They're just grabbed. That has died down considerably, and I think that reflects a realization in the White House that Kristi Noem again was political liability. But there's also no doubt, you're right, that the effort at large, massive deportation is continuing. It'll probably be handled with greater effectiveness moving forward, meaning that we're still going to see thousands of people being picked up, some of them with no cause, some of them with absolutely no legal basis, and being deported.
This is a far cry from, as you said earlier, the Trump who kind of rallied to get elected as the no new war president of peace and closing the borders, snatching people off the streets, abducting them, and in the cases of Alex and Renee, executing them, is a far cry from what he kind of offered on the campaign trail. So how much of this behavior and these aggressive authoritarian tactics that have ricocheted around the world now? I mean, America is now looked at not as a democracy anymore, not as a place, the land of the free and First Amendment rights and all that stuff. All that is on ice, it seems now, to coin a phrase, because of Donald Trump's desire to kind of bring out the very worst in humanity. Do you think that is a big problem for him at the ballot box too? Because as I see it, and you alluded to his base, I mean, even people that consider themselves moderates who still voted conservative, fiscal conservatives or whatever, they certainly did not vote for this.
Yeah, I think you've identified a real problem. And again, I'm looking at Donald Trump's political position today and projecting it forward, 9 or 10 months into the November elections. And what I see is that Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, they have removed what had been one of Donald Trump's top issues, which was illegal immigration, the need to conduct significant deportations, to build a secure barrier and wall on the southern border. That issue, which had worked remarkably well for Donald Trump against Democrats in 2024, has now been taken off the table because of what happened around the country and particularly in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And the polls showed us. I mean, it went from a very strong issue to being a toxic issue. And that is, when you look at, did ICE and DHS go too far? There's now 2/3 of Americans agreeing with that. And a substantial, again, minority, but a substantial number of Republicans agreeing with that too, because so many Republicans, do believe in individual rights. And they see these stories about people who are citizens who are just being picked up and thrown out of the country. We had some incredible stories in the Twin Cities of people just being dragged out of their house, no arrest warrant. It turns out they had the wrong person, the wrong house. I mean, it's again and again. And then the independents, again, have moved very strongly. So Republicans, we're seeing them kind of soft pedal that issue. And the new Secretary of Homeland Security, he said his main priority is to get ICE and DHS off the front pages. Okay. I think he's toned it down. We'll see how that plays out. But certainly in Twin Cities, it's not what we had seen. There is a pulling back. And then you have to ask, okay, has that political issue now been taken off the table? Perhaps they're hoping it'll come back, a couple of months and they can use it. But I don't think so. I think they've kind of created a real stench around deportation and immigration enforcement. Let me give you an example of this. One of Donald Trump's reasons for winning in 2024 was his success in winning over a historic number of Hispanic voters. And if you go back and you look at the redistricting in Texas, several of those redrawn districts counted on the Hispanic support in the 2024 election carrying over into the future. Well, recent polling shows no more. Donald Trump has probably lost some of those voters, and others appear uninterested in turning out to vote. They may not vote Democrat, but they're not going to turn out and vote for a Republican Party that supported this sort of police state. In Minnesota, Donald Trump has said really disparaging comments about the Somali population. My friends who are Republicans kind of gritted their teeth because they had been working, hard to recruit Somalis to vote for Republicans. The Somali population is not lock solid Democrat. It is quite diverse. And there are conservative Muslims who are very uncomfortable with the cultural agenda of the Democratic Party. And you see this, for instance, at school board meetings, and you see it in terms of the candidates who are running in the suburbs, Somali candidates. And I see it with my students who are Somali. There is a variety of views, not surprising. In Dearborn, Michigan, for instance, which is a majority Muslim area, voted majority for Donald Trump in 2024. My point here is simply that I think the issue of immigration enforcement, because of the way Donald Trump conducted it through his minions, has probably destroyed that issue for them politically, or certainly dampened it. Again, this is part of the reason I'm saying I think this is a weaker president today than he was a year ago. He's really sapped his powers. I think he's turned a good part of the country against them. I think he's right on the cusp of a kind of crisis of confidence where people simply don't believe him anymore. He gives a speech saying, yep, it's just a couple more weeks and the war will be over. And I don't think that's really tracking anymore. I think people are like, yeah, he said that a couple other weeks ago. Yeah. And, soon it'll be 2 months down the road and we'll still be in the war.
Yeah. Well, it'll be like his healthcare plan, which is on the way in 2 weeks. Let's talk about the fact that he's not on the ballot in November, but and claims he won't run again in 2028. But I personally don't believe that. Either way, with him endorsing candidates who may lose because of his unpopularity in the midterms, but certainly when it comes to the next general election, Donald Trump is not leaving the White House, is he? I mean, you're not building a fortress with a military installation underneath it to leave. You're building it to stay. And I know it seems kind of hypothetical this early on, and a lot of people are hoping that he's going to kind of meet the Grim Reaper before then through natural causes. But I personally think that he's in with both feet on this, and that we'll come up with a million reasons not to leave. And in fact, he has said in speeches that his greatest regret was leaving the White House in 2020 or 2021. So this is a problem that I think people need to start taking a little more seriously, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a bunch of issues for the future that we'll be dealing with, and that's a possibility. Of course, if there's an election and a Republican is elected, I think that Republican would expect him to leave, and I think the party would expect that to happen. If it's a Democrat, it's going to get more difficult, but I think we're seeing already that there are steps that can be taken by the courts, and we do have security services in Washington and elsewhere that might be mobilized. But this is far down the road. As you said, there are a lot of different scenarios for this playing out. It's also quite possible, maybe likely, that after the midterm elections, Donald Trump is going to see his power weaken even more than what I'm seeing right now. There's a phrase that's often used for a president in their second term, meaning they can't run for re-election, at least by the law, and that is lame duck.
Yeah.
And it just means that Republicans know he's never going to be in the ballot with them and that he's leaving office. You're going to have an increasing number of Republicans who will be, exploring presidential runs. I'm sure it'll be awkward with Trump there, but they're putting their hats out there. J.D. Vance may be one of them. He'll be coy about it, but there's no doubt there's a J.D. Vance book being written.
Yeah.
He's got his political consultants plotting. Rubio is another one who almost certainly be running. I mean, there's going to be a jockeying for who comes next and how they position themselves. Donald Trump can't control that. I mean, it's hard to fathom that because he's been such a colossus, and his voice is so loud, and he is, certainly unnerved and scared people. But I don't see him as someone who's going to be a dictator. I think this is someone who's weaker now than he was a year ago. He'll be weaker still in a year's time.
But isn't the issue with all dictators, if we look through history, Gaddafi or Pinochet, is that they are weak, but it's the bravado that kind of gives them that dictatorship. And the reality is often much less egregious than the propaganda. So I would say that the US is already under a dictatorship, that the dictatorship isn't on the way, that it is already happening. Now, I'm saying that as a European, so maybe I have permission and I'm not looking at it through, the lens of American exceptionalism. Is it that if you say it out loud, it might be true and therefore it's better just not to mention it?
No, I think it's important to say out loud. And I think there's every reason to be raising very serious questions about where we are right now. There's, we have seen conduct that is extraordinary. It's a violation of the law, of what is referred to as norms. So I think it's entirely legitimate. But Anthony, let me ask you a question. 6 months or 9 months ago, would you have expected the Supreme Court to overrule Donald Trump on tariffs, or to look like it's about to topple him on birthright? I mean, a lot of people were saying the court is in the bag. Donald Trump appointed them. They're just lackeys of Donald Trump. And yet the court, made this very strong decision on tariffs that was humiliation and a significant check on Donald Trump's efforts at control. It looks quite possible, though not certain, that they're going to be a strong opinion with regards to birthright. Now, these are essential aspects of Donald Trump's agenda. One is about kind of economic power. It is his economic, to the extent that he has any policy. Tariffs were supposed to be the centerpiece, and that's been weakened. It's not gone, but it's been weakened. And I think birthright is part of what is clearly a strong effort by the MAGA movement and others to reverse the increasing change in America. We are now just a short time from being a majority-minority country. And the idea of the birthright was a way to check that movement. And the Supreme Court, following judicial doctrine and the norms of the judiciary, appear to be poised to really strike down that. So yes, I fully understand what you're saying. I think there's certainly grounds for thinking that America has, with Donald Trump, some of the parallels with the dictatorship. But also I think the institutional, the legal, and the cultural traditions in this country are not the same as those other countries. I think there continues to be a vitality to them. And again, I'll just say this as someone living in Minnesota. There were some dark days in during the coldest parts of the winter. And, Americans took to the streets, very cold streets here,
yes.
Stood up to it. So I'm not ready to kind of say, game up. I think the battle for American democracy is on, and I'm seeing, life in it.
I don't disagree. I think that the resolve has been impressive, But it's hard because people are running out of options, aren't they? The Supreme Court is also hearing voting rights. And as you mentioned, with the SAVE Act and, which is effectively voter suppression, that there are multiple mechanisms that Trump has in place to try and rig the midterms at the legislature level. And then, of course, the refusal to certify. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that he might have up his sleeve. As I see it, the SAVE Act might not be successful, but ultimately there is already enough that's been said about voting, just the rhetoric, lying about immigrants voting, lying about how mail-in voting is in some way fraudulent. This all has an effect on the electorate, doesn't it?
It does. In fact, I have to tell you that about 15 years ago, I became concerned about the way in which our election system, I'm not talking about the politics, I'm talking about the counting of ballots, the administration of elections in America had been politicized. And this is 15 years ago. And so I've built over the last 15 years the largest training program for election officials. And, I teach in it, but all my other faculty are people who run elections in states. They're the top people at the national level. They're not political. They're really, they're technocrats. And I've gotten to know this world a bit better than I did before. And I'm just impressed by the independence, the kind of, the structure of it, the norms. It is, and I think when we think about Donald Trump's power to kind of override election results, again, it's understandable how he would get there because he talks a good game. He has gotten his way in plenty of areas, but it is an impossibility. The sheer administration of elections is enormous. It's hundreds of thousands of administrators. It's almost 10,000 different election precincts and voting areas. It's so radically decentralized that no one person can take control. Now, I have to say, for most of American history, that decentralization was seen as a problem because it allowed in southern parts of the states for segregation and other things to take hold because it wasn't a national control. Yes, there were civil rights laws, but still the administration of elections, too often we saw games being played that excluded or unfair to Americans of color. But now with Donald Trump, the radical decentralization, it is a check. I think that's going to prevent, any president, including Donald Trump, from taking control. Now, that does not address the issue you've raised, which is the lack of confidence. And I think that is the thing that most definitely Donald Trump has created. There's a real distrust in elections that we hadn't had before Donald Trump. The claims about massive fraud, which there's no evidence for. This has been looked at by, conservatives and others. We've had Donald Trump judges look at the ballots again and again and again. It's a lie. But people hear it. And so now, the good number of Americans want to, 20, 30% who believe that elections in America are not reliable. And that's a real problem. And it concerns me greatly. And I think, you're right to say that it's undermining what had been kind of the rock solid belief in American democracy.
There is a risk for Trump and for the Republican Party to push this SAVE Act and to cancel mail-in voting, because there isn't really a strong enough argument to say that will benefit Republicans at the ballot box. So do you think that this is a risk worth taking from their perspective, or could it backfire and actually benefit Democrats?
This is another area. I feel like we've come upon several of these where at first blush, it looks like Donald Trump is powerful and he's getting his way. But as you dig in deeper, he's either made a terrible mess of things. He's created enormous political blowback to himself and the Republican Party, or he's threatening to, basically tie a heavy weight on the ankles of Republicans. Mail-in ballots were for a long time the preferred strategy of Republicans. And if you look at, the electorate, older voters tended to vote Republican more often. And if you've got older voters who are, less mobile, a mail-in ballot was terrific. And in Florida, lots of the smart Republican political consultants counted on mail-in ballots to get the vote out. And so what Donald Trump is trying to do here, yes, I think could well backfire. I think it is one of the reasons that we are seeing the, kind of clever, subtle ways in which Republicans are blocking the SAFE Act in the United States Senate.
They know something that he doesn't, maybe. And this also suggests that he believes a lot of his own publicity. This argument that immigrants are voting is one of the reasons for him doing this, and yet there is no evidence of that. So that kind of almost proves that he's listening to the wrong people and getting the wrong intel. I have a final question for you, and that really is about you and your life and where you find the United States right now. If we were to go back to your earliest years in university, when you started on your journey, did you ever imagine that you would be having to have these conversations about fascism in America being mainstream and executions on the streets and abductions and the kinds of things that you would previously only have read about from far off lands? Because America has changed and people are not visiting now. Tourism is down significantly. International alliances, not least the Transatlantic Alliance, is almost certainly permanently damaged. So how do you feel just looking through your timeline, and did you ever predict this period would come around?
Absolutely not. I came into the study of politics convinced of American exceptionalism. I studied public opinion and its impact on American public policy, and saw a lot of evidence for that. And I believe that the norms, the laws, and institutional structures in this country created something close to a balancing of institutions. It was often ugly, it was often delayed, and it had all these imperfections that you could wring your hands about. But what we've seen today is something very different. We have seen an individual supported by a group of people run roughshod over laws, over the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We've seen Americans shot on our streets in clearly ways that were, police action that you would expect to see, frankly, in another country. But here it was in my hometown, just a short distance from me, where I'm sitting right now. So no, it's a very dire moment. I think we can talk about Donald Trump's vulnerabilities, but that does not in any way diminish the radical threat that he has introduced to American democracy at this moment.
Okay. I wish it was better times, but I'm grateful to you nonetheless for joining the show, Dr. Larry Jacobs.
Good to be with you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News or on my Substack at The Anthony Davis. You can also join the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.